Above the Dead Sea, the desert does not forgive much. Heat strips the hills bare. Wind moves through the ravines like a warning, and somewhere in that harsh, pale wilderness, a small opening in the limestone held a secret that had outlived empires. Inside were ancient scrolls, not one scroll, not a single relic placed carefully for display, but fragments of a buried library, texts hidden away, sealed in darkness, and left untouched for almost 2,000 years. They were not supposed to return, and yet, by accident, they did. The story begins not with kings or armies, but with a cave, a thrown stone, a sound from the dark. The kind of ordinary moment that history sometimes uses as a door. From there, the world would be forced to look again at ancient Judaism, the Bible before it was fixed in its familiar form, and a community that may have believed the end of days was close enough to prepare for. But before we follow the scrolls from cave to scholar, from desert rumor to guarded museum room, we need to slow down and stand for a moment in the landscape that preserved them. The Dead Sea lies low in the earth, heavy with salt, bordered by cliffs that seem almost emptied of color. It is a place where life feels reduced to essentials: stone, heat, silence, distance. And perhaps that is why the discovery feels so strange. A library is usually something human, orderly, protected. Here it reappeared from a place that looks designed to erase human traces. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. What was found in those caves was not simply old writing. It was a message from a frightened, divided, intensely religious world, a world that vanished, but not completely. The first mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not what they say. It is that they survived long enough to say anything at all. Most ancient writing disappears without ceremony. Papyrus decays. Leather stiffens, cracks, and becomes unreadable. Ink fades into stains. A manuscript can be lost to fire, damp, insects, war, neglect, or simply to the quiet impatience of time. The ancient world produced words constantly, but only a fraction of them reached us. History is not a complete archive. It is a damaged room after a storm. So when fragments of ancient manuscripts emerged from caves above the Dead Sea, the discovery felt almost unreasonable. Here were writings from a world nearly 2,000 years old, not copied in some medieval monastery centuries later, not preserved because a later institution considered them sacred enough to protect, but physically surviving from antiquity itself. Their presence changed the feeling of distance. Suddenly, scholars were not only reading traditions transmitted across generations, they were touching the material remains of people who had lived near the time when the Second Temple still stood in Jerusalem. That matters. A copied text tells us what later communities chose to preserve. A manuscript from the period itself tells us something raw. It shows spelling habits, scribal choices, textual variations, the wear of the material, even the practical world of storage and handling. It brings scholarship closer to the hands that made the object. But survival was not magic. The desert had done what few places on earth could do. The caves around Qumran were dry. The air was severe, The landscape offered little moisture and little mercy. In ordinary conditions, the same scrolls might have turned to dust long before anyone could find them. The Dead Sea region, with its arid climate and protective caves, became an accidental vault. Accidental, at least from our point of view. For the people who placed the scrolls there, the hiding may have been urgent, deliberate, and deeply human. Someone carried these writings into the desert caves. Someone chose jars, wrappings, openings in rock. Someone believed the texts were worth saving, or at least worth removing from danger. That decision is where preservation becomes story. Because a hidden library is never just a library. It is evidence of pressure. People do not usually carry manuscripts into caves unless the world outside has become unsafe, or unless the manuscripts themselves belong to a community that lives at the edge of society. The scrolls suggest a forgotten world close to ancient Judaism, but not identical with the forms that later became familiar. They preserve biblical books, interpretations, legal rules, hymns, calendars, apocalyptic visions, and writings shaped by disagreement. They speak from an age when Jewish identity was not a single settled thing, but a field of competing loyalties, arguments, hopes, and warnings. This is one of the easiest parts of the story to misunderstand. The scrolls did not fall from the sky as a complete lost Bible. They did not arrive with a simple label explaining who wrote them and why. They were fragments, in the most literal sense, torn pieces of a larger world. Some were large enough to read in long passages. Others were no more than scraps, surviving like broken edges of a vanished conversation. Their meaning had to be reconstructed slowly, with care, and sometimes with humility. The temptation, especially in a mystery like this, is to make the survival itself feel like a message. To imagine that the desert kept the scrolls for us, waiting for the modern age to be ready. But history is rarely so tidy. A better way to see it is this: the scrolls survived because human fear met the right geography. A community, or a network of people, found itself in a time of danger. The desert offered concealment. The caves offered darkness. The climate offered preservation. None of those things alone would have been enough. Together, they produced one of the most important manuscript discoveries ever made. And still, the question remains difficult. Why these texts? Why these caves? Why were some writings carefully stored, while others were left in conditions that later produced only fragments? Why were biblical books kept beside sectarian rules and visions of cosmic judgment? Were these the treasured library of a particular community, the emergency deposit of refugees, the remains of a wider collection brought from elsewhere, or some combination of all three? The evidence points in several directions, and that is part of the power of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do not allow a single clean answer. They pull us into the unsettled world that created them. A world where Scripture was revered, but not yet fixed in the exact form many readers know today. A world where religious groups argued not only about belief, but about purity, authority, calendars, priesthood, and the proper way to live before God. A world close enough to later Judaism and Christianity to feel familiar, yet old enough to resist being turned into a simple preface for either. That is why the phrase "lost library" is useful, but also incomplete. The scrolls are not merely a collection of old books. They are a survival of tension. They preserve the anxiety of a society that expected judgment. watched political power shift around it, and tried to define faithfulness in a fractured age. And perhaps that is why they still disturb the imagination, not because they reveal one forbidden secret, but because they reveal something more challenging, a religious world more diverse, more unstable, and more alive than later memory often allows. The cave preserved the manuscripts. The manuscripts preserved the arguments, and those arguments, once reopened, would make the ancient past feel less like a finished monument and more like a voice interrupted mid-sentence. The scrolls did not enter the modern world as a grand archaeological announcement. They came out quietly, awkwardly, almost suspiciously. According to the most familiar version of the story, Bedouin shepherds found the first cave by chance. A stone was thrown into darkness. Something broke inside. Not a treasure chest, not a gold vessel, a jar. That sound matters because it is almost absurdly small compared with what followed. A boy looking for a stray animal or testing a cave mouth out of curiosity could not have known that the crack of pottery would begin decades of scholarship, secrecy, legal disputes, religious anxiety, and international fascination. At first, the objects themselves may not have seemed especially glorious. Old leather, darkened writing, bundles that had survived in jars but did not announce their importance to anyone untrained in ancient scripts. To local Bedouin, they were unusual finds with possible value. To dealers, they were antiquities in a region where old objects had always moved through complicated channels. To scholars, once they began to understand what they were seeing, they were something or much more dangerous to professional calm. Manuscripts older than nearly anything they had handled from the biblical tradition. But that understanding did not arrive all at once. The first fragments moved through a world of uncertainty. They passed from the desert into markets, from hands that knew the landscape to hands that knew collectors, institutions, and scripts. Antiquities dealers became middlemen between the cave and the academy. Religious authorities and scholars examined pieces under conditions that were not always transparent. Some people doubted the age of the manuscripts. Some worried they were forgeries. Others saw enough to suspect that the discovery was real, and if it was real, enormous. This is the part of the story where the scrolls begin to acquire a modern life of their own. Ancient manuscripts do not simply get discovered. They enter systems of ownership, expertise, money, trust, and suspicion. Every handoff changes the story. A fragment removed from its cave loses part of its context. A scroll sold in pieces becomes harder to understand as a whole. A dealer may preserve something that might otherwise be discarded, but commerce also encourages secrecy. Scholars need access, but access often depends on institutions, politics, and personal connections. So from the very beginning, the Dead Sea Scrolls were surrounded by a strange tension. They were public treasures trapped in private pathways. That tension would never entirely disappear. Imagine the first scholars looking at the writing, not as a romantic scene, but as a technical, almost nervous one. The script had to be dated. The language had to be identified. The material had to be judged. The text had to be compared with known traditions. A line from Isaiah, a rule for a community, a passage that did not quite match later copies. Each detail had to be handled slowly. And yet there must have been a private shock in those rooms, because if the manuscripts were truly ancient, then the distance between the modern reader and the biblical world had suddenly narrowed. The scrolls were not later legends about antiquity. They were objects from antiquity. They belonged to a period when Jewish life in Judea was under pressure from empire, priestly conflict, competing interpretations of law, and deep expectations about divine judgment. Still, the early phase was messy enough to feel almost like a warning. The scrolls were too important for the casual market through which they first passed, but the market was exactly how they became visible. The scholars who could understand them were not the first to find them. The people who found them were not always the ones who could protect or interpret them. And the institutions that wanted to secure them often moved with a mixture of scholarly urgency and human possessiveness. There is no need to turn that into a simple villain story. That would be too easy and not entirely fair. The early scroll drama was shaped by a region already full of political tension. The late 1940s were not a quiet moment in the history of Palestine, Jordan, Israel, or the wider Middle East. Boundaries, authorities, and institutions were in motion. A manuscript could cross not only from one hand to another, but from one jurisdiction to another. What might sound like scholarly disorder was also the disorder of a land being remade around the discovery. That context is essential. Without it, the first fragments can look like a quaint adventure. Shepherds, caves, old jars, excited professors. With it, the scene becomes more serious. The scrolls emerged into a modern world almost as divided as the ancient one they described. Competing claims gathered around them immediately. Religious claims, national claims, academic claims, financial claims. Everyone seemed to understand, even before the full content was known, that these pieces of leather meant power of some kind. Not political power in the ordinary sense. Interpretive power. Whoever controlled the scrolls could help decide what they meant, which texts were published first, which theories gained attention, and which voices were allowed into the conversation. In scholarship, delay can become a form of authority. Access can shape history before history is even written. But in these first years, before the great controversies had fully formed, there was also something more innocent at work. Astonishment. Piece by piece, the fragments suggested that the cave had not contained a single manuscript, but a range of writings. Biblical texts, sectarian compositions, works of interpretation, rules, hymns, apocalyptic expectations. A library, though broken, began to appear in outline, and that changed the question. At first, people wanted to know, are these manuscripts genuine? Then the question became, how old are they? Then, what do they contain? And finally, the more haunting question, who hid them and what were they afraid of? The earliest fragments did not answer that. They complicated it. They proved that something extraordinary had been preserved, but they also showed how much had already been lost. Torn edges, missing columns, damaged lines, texts separated from jars, caves, and each other. The modern story began with discovery, but also with fragmentation. That is why the first movement of the scrolls feels so fitting. They came from a broken cave into a broken century, carrying the remains of a broken world. And as scholars followed their trail back toward the cliffs above the Dead Sea, attention began to settle on a nearby ruin, low, weathered, and easy to overlook from a distance. Qumran, a place that would become almost inseparable from the scrolls, even as its exact relationship to them remained one of the central arguments of the entire discovery. Not far from the caves, on a dry plateau above the Dead Sea, there are ruins that do not look dramatic at first glance. Low walls, broken rooms, channels cut through stone, the remains of cisterns, installations, and spaces that once had some kind of organized purpose. From a distance, Qumran can seem almost swallowed by the color of the land around it, as if the desert has been slowly teaching the place how to disappear. But archaeology is often built from things that do not impress the eye. A wall line, a water system, a pottery type, a cemetery, a room large enough to suggest communal activity. These are not theatrical clues, but they can change the meaning of an entire landscape. And once the scrolls were found in nearby caves, Qumran became more than a ruin. It became a suspect. The reasoning was understandable. Here were caves containing ancient Jewish manuscripts. Nearby stood the remains of a settlement from roughly the same broad historical world. The landscape connected them visually and geographically. If a group had lived at Qumran, and if that group had valued texts strongly enough to preserve, copy, or collect them, then perhaps the caves were not random hiding places. Perhaps they were the outer vaults of a community whose buildings stood exposed below. This connection became one of the great organizing ideas in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. For many scholars, Qumran offered the missing human setting. The scrolls were not just loose manuscripts. They became the library of a disciplined religious group. The ruins were read alongside the texts. Water installations suggested concern with purity. Communal spaces suggested shared life. The location, isolated from major urban centers, seemed to fit writings that speak of separation, strict rules, and a community set apart from a corrupt, wider society. The theory had elegance, perhaps too much elegance, because a theory that explains many things can begin, almost without anyone noticing, to explain more than the evidence can safely bear. Qumran and the scrolls are close to each other. That is a fact. The site was occupied in antiquity. That is also real. The texts include writings that seem sectarian, disciplined, and deeply concerned with purity and order. But the leap from those observations to a complete reconstruction of daily life is where caution becomes necessary. Archaeology does not speak in full sentences. It gives us fragments in a different form. The ruins can tell us that people lived, worked, gathered, stored water, used pottery, and buried their dead in the area. They cannot, by themselves, tell us every belief those people held. A ritual bath does not name a sect. A room with benches does not automatically become a scriptorium because we need one. A cave near a settlement does not prove that every text inside was written there. And yet, dismissing the connection entirely would also be too neat. The proximity is difficult to ignore. The number of manuscripts in the area is extraordinary. Some caves are close enough to Qumran that any serious explanation must account for the relationship between the site, the cliffs, and the scroll deposits. The question is not whether Qumran matters. It clearly does. The question is how. Was Qumran the home of the people who produced many of the scrolls? Was it a center where manuscripts were copied, studied, or stored? Was it a settlement associated with a wider movement whose writings came from different places? Or did the scrolls arrive there during a crisis, carried by people fleeing danger elsewhere? Each possibility shifts the story. If Qumran was a sectarian settlement, then the scrolls become intimate documents of a community living near the edge of the desert, ordering its life around purity, obedience, and expectation. If the scrolls came from elsewhere, perhaps even from collections connected to Jerusalem or other communities, then the caves become emergency hiding places for a broader Jewish literary world. If the truth is mixed, as it often is in history, then Qumran may have been both local and connected, not an isolated monastery of the desert, but part of a larger network of religious tension. This is why the ruins are so important. They force us to keep the scrolls grounded. Without Qumran, the manuscripts might float too easily into abstraction. A library without bodies, a theology without meals, rules without rooms, hopes without hands to carry water and mend walls. The ruin reminds us that ideas do not live in the air. They need communities, habits, landscapes, economies, and conflicts. At the same time, Qumran warns us against making the past too tidy. Modern viewers often want the camera to pan from a cave to a ruin and say, with confidence, "Here is where they lived. Here is where they wrote. Here is where they hid the texts." That would make for a clean documentary sentence. But the better story is less obedient. It admits that geography is evidence, not proof by itself. It recognizes that the relationship between manuscripts and ruins must be argued, not assumed. And that uncertainty does not weaken the story. It makes it more human. Because people in the ancient world moved, texts moved, ideas moved. A manuscript copied in one place could be read in another, hidden in a third, and discovered centuries later by someone with no connection to any of it. A religious community could own texts it did not compose. A library could preserve disagreement within itself. A cave could contain both local memory and imported fear. Qumran stands, then, as a threshold. On one side are the caves, dark, sealed, accidental survivors. On the other are the ruins, open to the sun, incomplete, stubbornly material. Between them lies one of the central questions of the scrolls. Not merely where were the manuscripts found, but what kind of human world made it possible for such a library to exist beside such a place? The answer most often proposed leads us toward a community known from ancient sources as the Essenes, or at least toward a group that looked, in some important ways, like them. But here again, the closer we move toward naming the people behind the scrolls, the more careful we have to become. A name can illuminate the past. It can also trap it. To imagine the people behind many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we should begin by resisting the easiest image. Not monks, not in the medieval sense, not robed figures moving through a desert monastery with candles and Latin chants and a neat little library schedule. That picture belongs to a later world. It may feel convenient, but convenience is one of history's quiet traps. The people often connected with Qumran lived in a Jewish world of priests, purity, law, sacrifice, scripture, debate, and expectation. Their concerns were not abstract. They were urgent. How should the calendar be calculated? Who had the authority to interpret the law? What made a person pure enough to belong? Was the Jerusalem priesthood legitimate? Or had something gone terribly wrong at the center of Jewish life? These were not minor disagreements. In that age, a dispute over ritual purity or the calendar was not like arguing over administrative details. It could mean that one group believed another was worshiping at the wrong time, in the wrong way. under the wrong leadership. It could mean that the holy order of the world had been disturbed. This is where the Essenes enter the story. Ancient writers describe the Essenes as a strict Jewish group, known for discipline, communal life, ritual concern, and separation from ordinary society. Because several features in those descriptions seem to echo themes in the scrolls, many scholars have long connected the Qumran community with the Essenes, or with a group closely related to them. But the wording matters. To say, the scrolls were written by the Essenes is stronger than the evidence always permits. To say some of the scrolls appear to reflect a sectarian Jewish community with features similar to what ancient sources report about the Essenes is less dramatic, but more honest. The difference may seem small, but it is the difference between using a theory and being used by one. What we can say with more confidence is that many of the sectarian writings imagine a community set apart. This was a group that valued order intensely. Admission was not casual. Belonging had stages. Members were expected to submit to communal discipline, follow rules, and accept a shared interpretation of divine law. Purity was not only a private virtue, it shaped the structure of daily life. Meals, gatherings, speech, rank, punishment, and ritual practice could all become signs of whether someone truly belonged. From a modern distance, it is tempting to call this extreme and leave it there, but that would miss the emotional logic. For people who believed the world was nearing judgment, strictness was not merely control, it was preparation. If history was moving toward a final confrontation between righteousness and wickedness, then ordinary compromise might look dangerous. A community could come to see itself as a small island of faithfulness in a polluted age. Every rule became a boundary. Every boundary became a statement. We are not them. That phrase, unspoken but powerful, may be one of the keys to the scrolls. We are not them, not the corrupt priests, not the careless interpreters, not the people who follow the wrong calendar, not the ones who have grown comfortable in a world awaiting divine correction. This kind of separation can give people strength. It can also sharpen resentment. It can preserve identity, and it can narrow vision. The scrolls do not give us a community trying to be pleasantly balanced for future documentaries. They give us people who seem to have believed that truth had enemies, that obedience required vigilance, and that the present age was morally unstable. Their world was not quiet simply because they lived near the desert. Inside the silence was argument. The desert setting matters because it gave physical shape to a spiritual decision. Whether Qumran was the main home of the group, one settlement among others, or only part of the story, the landscape around the caves feels almost like an argument in stone. To separate from the wider world here was not symbolic only. It meant distance, heat, scarcity. A life where water had to be managed carefully, where community discipline was not just theology, but survival. And yet we should be careful not to flatten them into fanatics. The scrolls also preserve learning, devotion, interpretation, and a profound seriousness about Scripture. These people, whoever exactly they were not simply waiting for the world to burn. They studied, they copied, they preserved. They argued through texts because they believed texts mattered. In their eyes, ancient words could reveal the pattern beneath history. That belief gave their library its intensity. A biblical passage was not merely inherited tradition. It could be a coded map of the present. A rule was not merely regulation. It could be the architecture of holiness. A hymn was not merely poetry. It could train the soul to endure a corrupt age. If the Essene connection is correct, or even partly correct, then the scrolls allow us to glimpse a form of Jewish religious life that later history did not preserve as a living institution. Rabbinic Judaism would develop along other lines. Christianity would tell a different story from within the same broad century of expectation and conflict. The Qumran-related movement, if that is what we are seeing, left no obvious descendants who carried its name safely into later tradition. Its survival came through hiding. That gives the scrolls their strange emotional force. We are not hearing a victorious community explaining itself after history approved it. We are hearing a group whose writings remained because they vanished from ordinary memory and reappeared by accident. Their silence was not peace, it was interruption. And there is something humbling in that. Most communities believe their arguments are central while they are alive. They write rules, condemn opponents, preserve teachings, assign meaning to suffering, and imagine that the future will vindicate them. Some are remembered, most are not. The people behind many of the scrolls were serious enough to leave behind a library, but history did not keep their story in a simple, continuous line. Instead, it left us fragments, rules without faces, expectations without fulfilled explanations, a community voice but not a complete community biography. So when we speak of the people behind the silence, we are really speaking of an outline filled in carefully and sometimes too confidently by modern readers. The Essenes may stand near the center of the best-known theory, but the scrolls themselves are more complicated than any single label. They reveal a disciplined religious world, deeply Jewish, intensely textual, separated by conviction, and charged with the feeling that time itself was approaching a crisis. That is the atmosphere we must carry forward. Because once a community believes it is living near the edge of history, even Scripture begins to look different. It is no longer only a record of the past. It becomes a mirror, a weapon, a warning, and a promise. One of the quiet revolutions of the Dead Sea Scrolls was not that they destroyed the Bible, or exposed it as false, or revealed some hidden book that overturned everything. That is the kind of claim that travels well in headlines and badly in scholarship. The real change was more subtle, and in some ways more interesting. The scrolls showed that the biblical text had a history before it reached the stable form many people know today. Not a chaotic free-for-all, not a careless mess, but a living, textual world. Familiar books were already deeply respected. They were copied, studied, quoted, interpreted, and preserved. Yet some of those books existed in forms that were not always identical to the later standard Hebrew text. To understand why that matters, we have to step away from the modern idea of a Bible as a single printed object. Today, a Bible can sit on a shelf as a finished volume, with a fixed order, numbered chapters, standardized verses, and a sense of completeness so familiar that it becomes invisible. But the world of the scrolls came before that kind of final packaging. The books existed, but the boundaries and exact textual forms were still more fluid than later readers might expect. This does not mean ancient people were casual about Scripture. Quite the opposite. The people behind the scrolls treated sacred writings with enormous seriousness. Their reverence is visible in the effort to copy them, preserve them, and read them as guides to the meaning of their own age. But reverence and textual uniformity are not the same thing. A community can honor a text intensely while still living in a world where different manuscript traditions circulate. That is the important distinction. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were copies of books that would become part of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Psalms, and many others. Some were close to the later Masoretic text, the medieval Hebrew tradition that became central in Jewish textual transmission. Others resembled forms known from the Greek Septuagint, or showed readings that did not align neatly with one later tradition. Some differences were small: a spelling variation, a word order, a phrase. Others opened larger questions about how books were copied and transmitted before standardization. The point is not that every difference was dramatic. Many were not. But the accumulation of differences revealed a world in which Scripture was both authoritative and still in motion at the level of textual transmission. That is a difficult combination for modern minds trained by printed books. We often assume authority requires perfect uniformity. The scrolls suggest that, in the Second Temple period, sacred authority could exist amid manuscript diversity. That changes the emotional texture of the ancient world. A scribe copying Isaiah near the Dead Sea was not simply preserving an antique. He was participating in a chain of transmission whose exact shape was still being formed. A community reading Deuteronomy was not necessarily reading a text identical in every detail to the one printed today. Yet they may have regarded it as holy, binding, and urgent. This is where the scrolls complicate both skepticism and certainty. For the skeptic hoping the scrolls would reveal that Scripture was merely invented late and loosely, the evidence does not cooperate. The biblical books were already old, valued, and widely transmitted by the time many scrolls were copied. Their presence in the caves shows deep continuity. For the person hoping the scrolls would prove that the text had never varied in any meaningful way, the evidence does not cooperate there either. The manuscripts show variation. They show that ancient textual transmission was real, human, and layered. The scrolls do not give either side a simple victory. They ask for a more mature imagination. What survived in the caves was Scripture before the age of total standardization. Not Scripture before belief. Not Scripture before reverence. Scripture before the later closing of certain textual possibilities. That is why the biblical manuscripts from the Dead Sea are so valuable. They allow scholars to compare versions across time, not through guesswork alone, but through physical evidence. Before the scrolls, many of the oldest complete Hebrew biblical manuscripts available were from much later centuries. Suddenly, there were fragments and scrolls that pushed the witness back dramatically, closer to the world of Second Temple Judaism itself. The effect was like hearing an old melody played on an instrument from the time when the song was still being arranged. Recognizable but not frozen. There is a kind of beauty in that. The familiar books appear not as monuments dropped whole into history, but as texts carried by communities, copied by hands, interpreted under pressure, and preserved through devotion. Their authority did not prevent them from having a history. Their history did not erase their authority for the people who lived by them. The scrolls also remind us that the Bible was not experienced the same way by every Jewish group of the period. Some books seem to have held wide authority. Others occupied a more complicated space. The Psalms, for example, appear not only as inherited prayer and poetry, but as material that could be collected, arranged, and expanded in ways that raise questions about how fixed the collection was. Other writings found among the scrolls, such as Jubilees or Enochic traditions, were clearly important to some groups, even though they would not occupy the same place in later Jewish canon. This is not a minor footnote. It changes how we imagine the religious landscape. The people of this period were not walking around with a single identical table of contents in their minds. They inherited traditions, argued over interpretation, valued certain writings intensely, and drew boundaries that were still developing. Different communities could share much and still disagree profoundly about which texts mattered most, how to read them, and what kind of life they required. That helps explain why the scrolls feel so charged. For the group behind many of the sectarian writings, Scripture was not distant literature. It was alive with hidden meaning. Ancient prophecy could speak directly to their own conflict. A commandment could separate the faithful from the corrupt. A psalm could become the language of a community waiting for deliverance. Their library was not arranged for curiosity. It was built for identity. And yet, from our side of history, the biblical scrolls also do something gentler. They reduce the distance between the ancient scribe and the modern reader. You can look at a fragment of a familiar book and realize that someone, long before printing presses or bound Bibles, cared enough to copy those words in ink on prepared skin. Their world was not ours. Their assumptions were not ours. But the act of preservation is understandable across the centuries. A hand writes. A community listens. A text is carried forward. Then danger comes, and the text is hidden. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not give us a Bible entirely unlike the one later transmitted. Nor did they give us a perfectly uniform text untouched by the conditions of history. They gave us something more valuable, evidence of Scripture as a living inheritance in an unsettled age. And once we see that, the next layer of the library becomes even more revealing. Because beside the biblical manuscripts were writings that did not merely preserve sacred tradition. They organized a community around it. They set rules. They divided humanity into camps. They imagined the end of history not as a metaphor, but as an approaching conflict. For some readers of the scrolls, Scripture was not only something to be copied, it was something to survive by. A community reveals itself most clearly in the things it chooses to regulate, not only its grand beliefs, not only its prayers, its rules. Who may enter? Who must wait? Who speaks first? Who eats with whom? What happens when someone lies, interrupts, disobeys, mocks another member, or breaks the order of the group? These details can feel small, even dry, until we realize what they are really doing. They are drawing a map of the community's fears. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian writings open a door into a world where discipline was not a side issue. It was central. The people behind these texts did not imagine holiness as a private feeling tucked away inside the heart. They imagined it as a shared structure, visible, ranked, inspected, and defended. To modern ears, that can sound severe, and it was severe. But severity had a purpose. The community seems to have believed that it was living in a period of corruption and approaching judgment. In such a world, ordinary life could not remain ordinary. The smallest act might reveal whether a person belonged to the side of truth or had slipped toward the side of deception. A meal could become a sign of covenant. A council meeting could become a rehearsal for divine order. A rule about speech could become a defense against chaos. This is one of the stranger gifts of the scrolls. They show us apocalyptic expectation, not as vague drama, but as administration. The end of days had paperwork. There were procedures, ranks, punishments, admissions, exclusions, and carefully defined obligations. The community did not simply wait on a hilltop staring at the horizon. It organized itself. It trained itself. It tried to become, in advance, the kind of purified society it believed would survive the final crisis. That is what makes the sectarian rules so compelling. They are not merely religious regulations. They are evidence of a group attempting to live as though the final sorting of history had already begun. In some writings, the world is divided sharply between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, the righteous and the wicked. This kind of dualism is not gentle. It leaves little room for ambiguity. The community understood itself as part of a cosmic struggle, not just a local disagreement. Human conflict reflected a deeper battle built into the moral fabric of the age. And once people see themselves that way, compromise becomes spiritually dangerous. A rival priest is not just mistaken. He may be aligned with darkness. A different calendar is not just a technical alternative. It may represent rebellion against divine order. A careless member is not merely annoying. He threatens the purity of the whole. This is where the scrolls become both fascinating and uncomfortable. They preserve sincere devotion, intense study, and moral seriousness. But they also preserve the psychology of separation. The belief that a small group sees clearly while the majority has fallen into error can be powerful. It can sustain people under pressure. It can also harden them. The same conviction that protects identity can turn every disagreement into a battlefield. The writings, often called community rules, help us feel that tension. They imagine a disciplined body bound by shared property, shared instruction, and shared obedience. Entry into the group could require testing over time. Rank mattered. Elders, priests, and knowledgeable members held authority. Transgression could bring penalties, sometimes temporary exclusion from communal privileges. The group seems to have understood itself not as a casual gathering of believers, but as an ordered remnant. A remnant is different from a congregation. A congregation may believe it is part of a broad religious world. A remnant believes the broad world has failed. That distinction changes everything. If you are the remnant, then survival is not enough. You must remain uncontaminated. You must preserve the right teaching against a corrupt age. You must read the signs correctly. And if the end is near, there may not be time for softness. The apocalyptic writings intensify this atmosphere. Some texts imagine a final war, a cosmic conflict in which the forces of light confront the forces of darkness. These are not calm philosophical reflections on good and evil. They are battle plans for the imagination. They give fear a shape, and they give hope a timetable, even when that timetable remains mysterious. But here we need to be precise. The scrolls do not allow us to say exactly how every member of the community pictured the end, or whether every text found in the caves was believed in the same way by the same people. A library can contain older traditions, borrowed works, copied texts, and internal variety. The presence of a writing does not always prove uniform belief. Still, The repeated themes are hard to ignore: purification, judgment, separation, conflict, divine intervention, and the conviction that history was moving toward a decisive moment. For the people who preserved these writings, the present was not spiritually neutral. It was charged. That helps explain why their rules could be so exacting. Rules were not just about keeping order until something happened. Rules were how the community participated in what it believed was already happening. To obey was to take one's place in the camp of light. To break discipline was to blur the line at the very moment when lines mattered most. There is a modern tendency to treat apocalyptic groups as irrational by default. Sometimes that is deserved, but in this case, the more careful question is not, why did they believe such strange things? It is, what conditions made this vision of the world feel responsible? Their society was marked by foreign power, internal Jewish dispute, priestly controversy, and the memory of sacred promises that seemed, to many, unresolved. In that environment, apocalyptic thinking could offer a kind of order. It explained why the righteous suffered. It named enemies. It promised that hidden truth would eventually be revealed. It turned historical confusion into a story with direction. That is not the same as saying it was correct. It is saying it made sense to those inside it. And that is one of the tasks of good history. Not to agree with the dead, but to understand why their world could produce minds so different from our own. The sectarian writings also remind us that religion in this period was not only about doctrine, it was about time. Who owns the present? Who understands the past? Who is prepared for the future? The people behind these texts seem to have believed that most of their contemporaries were misreading all three. So they built a counterworld, a disciplined community inside a fractured society, a purified order inside what they saw as corruption, a library of rules, hymns, interpretations, and visions meant to hold the group together until God acted. Whether their expectations were disappointed, transformed, or overtaken by history, we cannot reconstruct with certainty. The writings do not give us a final diary entry. They do not say, "Here is the day everything ended for us." They leave us instead with preparation, elaborate, intense, and unfinished. That unfinished quality is what makes them haunting. The rules still speak as if obedience matters urgently. The war visions still gather the world into opposing camps. The community still waits in the grammar of its own texts. And somewhere behind these documents, behind the penalties and prayers and images of final battle, there are names we almost know but cannot quite reach. A revered teacher, a hostile opponent, a conflict remembered in coded language. The scrolls do not only describe a community preparing for the end, they hint at wounds already opened within history. Every movement has its public beliefs, and then there are the wounds. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us a clean history of the community behind many of their writings. They do not introduce characters the way a historian would prefer. No calm opening paragraph tells us the date, the city, the names, the sequence of events, and the reason everyone became so angry. Instead, the scrolls offer something more difficult. Charged references, titles, accusations, fragments of memory. A teacher of righteousness, a wicked priest, a man of the lie. Opponents who seem not merely mistaken, but dangerous. A conflict described with religious intensity, yet without enough detail to let us identify everyone with certainty. This is the kind of evidence that invites both scholarship and overconfidence. The teacher of righteousness appears to have been a revered figure for the sectarian community reflected in some texts. He was remembered as someone with special insight into the meaning of Scripture and the will of God. Not simply a good instructor, but a leader whose interpretation helped define the group's identity. Through him, the community seems to have understood itself as chosen, instructed, and separated from those who had gone astray. But the teacher is not a biographical subject in the modern sense. We do not have his childhood. We do not have a portrait. We do not have a signed letter saying, "I, the teacher, hereby explain the origin of our movement." What we have are traces of reverence. We have the shape of authority preserved inside polemic and interpretation. That makes him powerful, but elusive. The enemies are even more shadowed. The wicked priest is described as a figure of corruption and hostility. The man of the lie seems connected with false teaching or opposition to the community's truth. These names sound almost theatrical now, but we should remember that they were not invented for our entertainment. They belong to a world where religious conflict could be encoded in scriptural language. To name an opponent this way was to place him inside a moral universe. It was not just insult, it was interpretation. The community was saying, "Our conflict is not ordinary. Our enemies are part of the meaning of history." This is where the scrolls become psychologically revealing. They show how a group can transform a dispute into sacred memory. A conflict over leadership, priesthood, law, calendar, or interpretation becomes more than an argument between factions. It becomes proof that the community stands with truth against deception. The teacher is not merely our teacher. He is righteous. The opponent is not merely their leader. He is wicked, false, aligned with error. Such language gives suffering purpose. If the teacher was opposed, persecuted, or rejected, the community could read that pain as confirmation rather than defeat. The righteous are resisted. The truth is hated. The faithful remnant must endure misunderstanding until God vindicates them. This pattern appears again and again in religious history, not because every movement is the same, but because communities under pressure often need a way to make defeat meaningful. The scrolls do not let us reduce this to propaganda, though. There may well have been real conflict behind the coded titles. Some scholars have tried to connect the teacher and his opponents to known figures in the history of Second Temple Judea, especially struggles involving priestly authority in Jerusalem. Others are more cautious, arguing that the evidence does not allow firm identification. The problem is not that the scrolls say nothing. The problem is that they say just enough to tempt us into saying too much. And that is a danger in this story. A name like wicked priest almost begs to be solved. It feels like a locked drawer in a mystery novel. Find the right historical figure, insert the key, and suddenly the whole plot opens. But ancient evidence is rarely that obedient. The title may refer to a specific person. It may preserve memory of more than one opponent shaped into a single symbol. It may have been understood clearly by insiders while remaining opaque to everyone outside the group. The original audience did not need footnotes. We do. What can be said with more confidence is that the community behind these writings understood itself through conflict. Its identity was not only built around rules and expectations for the end of days, it was built around a remembered rupture. Someone had taught the right path. Someone else had opposed it. The group had separated, or been driven apart. or come to believe that separation was the only faithful response. That remembered wound gave their texts urgency. When they interpreted Scripture, they were not doing neutral study. They were reading ancient words as if those words had been waiting for their own crisis. Prophets spoke about them. Psalms described their suffering. Commands justified their discipline. The past became a coded explanation of the present. This may sound strange until we notice how often human beings do the same thing. People in conflict search for larger stories. Nations do it. Religious groups do it. Families do it in smaller ways. A painful break becomes easier to carry when it is placed inside a narrative of betrayal, courage, corruption, and vindication. The scrolls preserve one ancient version of that human act, the making of meaning under pressure. Still, there is a sadness in the fragments. The teacher's followers preserved his importance, but not enough for us to know him fully. His enemies were condemned, but not clearly identified. The conflict mattered deeply to those who lived through its memory, yet it reaches us like voices from behind a wall. We can hear intensity. We cannot always hear circumstance. That distance should make us careful. It should also make us attentive. Because the hidden war in the scrolls is not only a war of armies, though some texts imagine battles to come. It is a war over interpretation. Who reads Scripture correctly? Who speaks for God? Who has authority to define purity, time, priesthood, and the fate of the community? Before swords are drawn in apocalyptic vision, lines have already been drawn in reading rooms, assemblies, and councils. The struggle begins with meaning. That may be the most important clue. The scrolls come from a world where texts were not passive. They could authorize a life, condemn a rival, organize a settlement, and frame history itself. To control interpretation was to control reality. For the community behind many of these writings, the teacher of righteousness seems to have opened the true pattern. His opponents, by contrast, threatened to corrupt not only doctrine, but time, worship, and destiny. No wonder the language is fierce, and no wonder the identities remain disputed. History often preserves the titles people use in battle better than the private names behind them. The righteous, the wicked, the liar, the faithful, the corrupt. Such labels are sharp enough to survive, but not always clear enough to satisfy later curiosity. So we are left with a conflict that feels both intimate and unreachable. A teacher without a face, an enemy without a settled name, a community still arguing across 2,000 years, not because we can hear every word, but because the fragments refuse to become quiet facts. They pulse with allegiance. They remember injury. They insist that the truth was contested and that the contest mattered. And beyond that internal struggle, a larger pressure was building across Judea. Rome watched. Jerusalem trembled under the weight of power, priesthood, faction, and revolt. The community's private war of interpretation belonged to a society already moving toward catastrophe. Soon, hiding words in caves would no longer seem strange. It would seem necessary. By the middle of the 1st century, Judea was not simply tense. It was strained in almost every direction. Rome stood over the region with the patience of an empire that knew patience could be backed by soldiers. Local rulers and priestly elites navigated power carefully, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resented for cooperating. Jerusalem remained the sacred center. But sacred centers are rarely peaceful just because they are holy. They attract devotion, money, authority, argument, and suspicion. For many Jews of the period, the temple was not merely an important building. It was the heart of worship, sacrifice, memory, and national hope. Yet the closer something stands to the center of a religious world, the more devastating it becomes when people believe that center has been corrupted. That belief appears to have mattered deeply to the circles reflected in some of the scrolls. The conflict was not only Rome versus Judea, though Roman power was impossible to ignore. It was also Judea arguing with itself. Priests, interpreters, movements, teachers, rebels, aristocrats, ordinary villagers, and apocalyptic groups all inhabited the same pressured landscape, but they did not always imagine faithfulness in the same way. Some sought accommodation, some sought reform, some withdrew, some waited for God to act, some eventually chose revolt. The scrolls belong to this wider atmosphere of fragmentation, even when they do not give us a simple political diary. They breathe the air of a society where authority was contested and the future felt unstable. When a community writes about wicked leaders, false interpreters, final judgment, and the war between light and darkness, it is not doing so from a world that feels safe and settled. This is why the Roman context matters. Empire changes the meaning of religious disagreement. Under ordinary conditions, a dispute over priesthood or law can divide communities. Under imperial pressure, that same dispute can become part of a larger question. Who truly represents the people before God when foreign power dominates the land? Who has compromised? Who has remained pure? Who is reading the times correctly? Rome did not need to create every Jewish conflict to intensify them. It only needed to be there. Its presence sharpened old questions and added new dangers. Taxation, military authority, political appointments, and the visible fact of foreign rule could make ancient promises feel painfully unresolved. If Israel's God ruled history, why did Rome rule the roads, the courts, and the fortresses? Different groups answered that question differently. Some answers were practical, some were theological, some were explosive. The community behind many of the scrolls seems to have answered with separation and expectation. They did not appear to place their hope in ordinary politics. Their writings suggest a deeper conviction. The present order was temporary, corrupt, and destined for divine judgment. This did not necessarily make them revolutionaries in the conventional sense. Apocalyptic thinking can produce rebellion, but it can also produce withdrawal, discipline, waiting, and the belief that human action must remain subordinate to God's timetable. That distinction is important. It would be too simple to imagine the scrolls as rebel propaganda. It would also be too simple to imagine them as detached spiritual literature floating above history. They stand somewhere more interesting. They show religious minds interpreting a real crisis through inherited scripture, communal discipline, and cosmic expectation. Then came the catastrophe toward which so many tensions moved. The Jewish revolt against Rome, beginning in the late 60s of the 1st century, and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in the year 70. For later history, that destruction is one of the great turning points. It reshaped Judaism. It altered the world in which early Christianity was developing. It broke the central institution around which Jewish sacrifice had revolved. The loss of the temple was not just architectural, It was theological, social, political, and emotional. For the scrolls, the relationship to that catastrophe is debated. Some manuscripts were likely hidden before or during the period of danger associated with the revolt and Roman military action in the region. That does not mean every scroll was placed in a cave on the same day by the same people for the same reason. The caves may preserve different moments of concealment, different collections, different levels of urgency. But the general idea is compelling. When violence approached, precious texts were moved out of sight. This is not difficult to understand. When a community senses collapse, it saves what tells it who it is. Some people save weapons. Some save money. Some save family records. Some save sacred writings, because for them, a text is not merely information. It is identity under threat. If the scrolls were hidden in response to approaching danger, then the act was both practical and tragic. Practical, because caves offered concealment in a region where survival could depend on what remained unseen. Tragic, because hidden manuscripts often imply owners who expected to return, or at least hoped someone would. The scrolls waited nearly 2,000 years. Whoever hid them did not come back in any way we can recognize. That absence gives the caves their weight. We should be cautious here. It is tempting to imagine a final dramatic scene. Frightened members carrying jars by night, hearing distant Roman movement, sealing the cave with trembling hands. Something like that may have happened. Or the reality may have been slower, more disordered, less cinematic. Collections could have been deposited over time. Some hiding may have been careful. Some may have been hurried. Some scrolls may have belonged to local sectarians. Others may have come from broader Jewish collections. The evidence does not let us turn the concealment into a single movie scene. But it does let us say that these manuscripts survived because, at some point, people treated them as worth protecting. That fact is enough. It tells us that the writings mattered before they mattered to us. Long before scholars numbered fragments and debated theories, someone valued these texts in a world where value had consequences. A scroll could take labor to prepare, skill to copy, and care to preserve. To hide such an object was to make a wager against destruction, and in a strange way, that wager succeeded. Not for the community, perhaps, not for the temple, not for the political world of first-century Judea. Those suffered losses that no cave could prevent. But the words survived. They survived Rome's victory, the ruin of Jerusalem, the disappearance or transformation of the groups that cherished them, and the long centuries in which no one knew they were there. This is where the story grows larger than Qumran alone. The scrolls are not just the remains of one possible sectarian settlement. They are a witness to an entire age under pressure. They remind us that the period before Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity fully emerged was not a quiet hallway between older and newer religions. It was a crowded, argumentative, spiritually restless world, full of competing answers to catastrophe. And catastrophe has a way of deciding which voices continue. Some traditions adapt and survive openly. Some are defeated but remembered by opponents. Some disappear almost entirely. Some are placed in jars and left in caves above a salt sea. The irony is hard to miss. Rome destroyed Jerusalem's temple, but it did not destroy every trace of the religious imagination that had flourished in that tenth century. The desert kept what history might have erased. Not because the desert cared, but because dryness, darkness, and human urgency briefly aligned. When the scrolls were hidden, they belonged to a world nearing collapse. When they were found, they forced the modern world to revisit that collapse not through monuments or victory inscriptions, but through fragile manuscripts, rules, prayers, biblical copies, visions, arguments, and hopes. A civilization's crisis had left behind not only ruins, it had left behind reading material. And among that material, one object would seem stranger than all the rest. Not leather, not parchment, not ordinary ink, but metal. A scroll made of copper, listing hidden deposits of treasure with a precision that still unsettles scholars. If the other scrolls preserved a world of belief, this one seemed to whisper of something more earthly. Gold, silver, and the possibility that somewhere, beneath the old landscape, another secret remained buried. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls ask us to think about words, words copied by hand, words interpreted as sacred, words shaped into rules, hymns, warnings, and visions of the end. Even when the manuscripts are damaged, their world is textual. They belong to ink, skin, and the careful labor of scribes. Then there is the copper scroll. It feels like an interruption. Not parchment, not leather, not a fragile sheet meant to be rolled, unrolled, read, repaired, and copied in the ordinary way. This was metal, thin copper, inscribed with writing, and so corroded that modern scholars could not simply open it like a normal scroll. It had to be cut apart to be read. Even the method of access felt almost aggressive, as though the object refused to enter scholarship politely. And what it seemed to contain was stranger still. A list of hidden deposits, gold, silver, vessels, quantities, locations, directions that sound at times maddeningly specific and yet practically unhelpful. It is one of the great oddities of the Qumran discoveries. A treasure map without a treasure. A document that speaks in the language of inventory, but has produced no agreed recovery of the riches it describes. Naturally, this is where imagination begins to run. Treasure has a dangerous effect on sober thought. It makes everyone lean forward. A damaged rule text may interest historians. A copper list of buried wealth interests almost everybody. Suddenly, the desert is not only a place of scripture and sectarian discipline. It becomes a landscape of concealed chambers, lost temple vessels, secret deposits, and the possibility that somewhere beneath stone and salt, something still waits. But the copper scroll is not simple. That is the first thing to hold on to. It may record real treasure. Some scholars have suggested that the wealth described could be connected with the Jerusalem temple, perhaps hidden during the crisis before the Roman destruction. If that is the case, then the scroll would be a desperate inventory from a world trying to save sacred wealth from imperial seizure. The idea is dramatic, but not absurd. In times of war, valuables are hidden. Temples possess wealth. A collapsing society might scatter what it cannot defend. Yet the difficulties are serious. The amounts listed are enormous. The locations are obscure. Many place references are no longer identifiable with confidence, if they ever could be from outside the document's original context. The style of the copper scroll differs from the sectarian writings. It does not sound like a community rule, a hymn, or an apocalyptic interpretation. It reads more like a dry catalog of deposits. though a catalog from a world whose geography has partly vanished. This creates a problem that has never fully gone away. If the treasure was real, why has none of it been securely found through the scroll's directions? Were the deposits recovered long ago? Were the clues intentionally coded? Have the landmarks disappeared? Was the list copied from another source? Or are we dealing with something symbolic, legendary, or ritualized rather than a practical map? Each answer solves one problem and creates another. A purely symbolic reading makes the enormous wealth easier to explain, but the document's concrete tone resists being turned too quickly into metaphor. A real treasure inventory explains the specificity, but not the failure to identify the locations or recover the hoards. A temple treasure theory gives the object historical weight, especially against the background of Jerusalem's destruction. But the connection remains debated rather than proven. The copper scroll sits in that uncomfortable space between evidence and desire. Desire matters here. Not ancient desire only, but modern desire. We want it to be a treasure map because treasure maps satisfy a very old part of the mind. They promise that history has not merely left ideas behind, but objects. Heavy, shining, measurable objects. Gold is easier to picture than textual transmission. Silver is easier to film than a disputed calendar. The copper scroll tempts us to exchange complexity for excitement, and that is exactly why it must be handled carefully. Its importance does not depend on whether someone eventually finds a hidden cache. The object is already important because it shows that the Qumran caves preserved more than one kind of memory. Not all the scrolls speak in the same voice. Not all belong neatly to the same literary category. The library, or collection of deposits, included scripture, sectarian texts, interpretive writings, and this strange metallic list that seems to come from a different world of concern. That variety should slow us down. It reminds us that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single book with a single argument. They are a collection shaped by history, accident, crisis, preservation, and possibly by different communities or sources. The copper scroll may have been stored with other scrolls, but that does not mean it was created for the same purpose as the others. Its presence complicates the idea of one tidy sectarian library. Perhaps that is its greatest value. It disrupts confidence. Just when the story seems to settle into a pattern, desert community, sacred texts, apocalyptic rules, hidden manuscripts, the copper scroll appears and asks a more blunt question. What else was being hidden? Not only teachings, not only prayers, maybe wealth, maybe sacred vessels, maybe records of deposits whose meaning has been lost, maybe an inventory connected to a crisis so urgent that metal seemed a safer medium than parchment, or maybe something stranger, a list that was never meant for outsiders, preserved without the key that made it usable. Imagine reading directions to a place whose landmarks have been erased. Near the cistern, under the steps, at the entrance. These phrases may have once been clear to someone. Across 2,000 years, they become almost cruel. The text points with confidence toward a world that no longer holds still. That is the copper scroll in miniature. Confident instructions, lost coordinates, a voice that knows exactly where the treasure is, speaking to listeners who do not. There is a certain dark humor in that. After all the solemnity of Scripture, purity, and cosmic war, One of the most famous scrolls essentially leaves modern scholars arguing over ancient directions that may or may not lead to a fortune. It is the closest the collection comes to sounding like a riddle, deliberately designed to ruin careers and weekends. But beneath the humor is something more serious. The Copper Scroll reveals how easily the scrolls became magnets for expectation. Once treasure entered the story, the public imagination had another reason to believe the caves held secrets still withheld. And when treasure, religion, ancient texts, and limited scholarly access all gather around the same discovery, suspicion grows almost naturally. The scrolls were already difficult. They were fragmented. They were controlled by small groups of experts. They required technical knowledge to read. Their publication was slow. Their implications touched the Bible, Judaism, Christianity, and the history of religious authority. Add the possibility of hidden riches, and the whole discovery begins to feel, to outsiders, less like scholarship and more like a locked room. The Copper Scroll did not create the later rumors by itself, but it helped teach the world to look at the Dead Sea caves as places where something might still be concealed. Not just unread texts, not just unresolved arguments, something buried, something guarded by damaged words, something that might transform the story if only the right person could decipher the clues. The treasure may never be found. It may not exist in the way treasure hunters imagine. It may have existed once and vanished before modern searchers ever arrived. What remains is the document itself, metallic, stubborn, practical in tone, and mysterious in effect. A scroll that does not pray, preach, or interpret prophecy. A scroll that lists, and by listing, it opened one of the most persistent questions in the entire discovery. Were the caves protecting a library, a sectarian archive, emergency deposits from a collapsing Jerusalem, or a mixture of things we are still too eager to simplify? The Copper Scroll gives no final answer. It only points into the ground. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the desert, but their second hiding place was modern scholarship. Not in caves this time. In offices, museums, institutions, guarded archives, and small academic circles where access mattered almost as much as knowledge. This is where the story changes texture. The landscape narrows. The wind and cliffs give way to tables covered in fragments. Handwritten notes, photographs, permissions, disputes, and the slow, almost painful work of reading damaged texts. It is less cinematic at first glance, but no less important. Because once the scrolls entered the modern world, the central question became not only what had survived, but who would be allowed to decide what survival meant. The difficulty was real. Thousands of fragments had to be sorted, matched, photographed, transcribed, translated, and interpreted. Many pieces were tiny. Some were darkened, curled, or broken along lines that made reconstruction maddening. A single manuscript might survive in scattered bits. A line could depend on the shape of one letter. A word could change the meaning of a passage. This was not a task for impatience. So the slow pace of publication cannot be explained only by secrecy. That would be unfair. There was a mountain of technical work, and the mountain was made of scraps. But unfairness can run in the other direction too. Because the slowness was not only about difficulty, it was also about control. A relatively small group of scholars held privileged access to major portions of the unpublished material for years. Outside researchers waited, Rumors spread. Frustration grew. The scrolls had been found by accident in the desert, but access to them began to look almost hereditary, passed through academic gatekeeping rather than opened to the wider world of scholarship. For those on the inside, the restrictions may have seemed practical. Someone had to organize the work. Someone had to protect fragile materials. Someone had to prevent chaotic, careless publication. Serious scholarship requires standards, and the scrolls deserved more than a race for headlines. But from the outside, the arrangement looked different. Here were texts of enormous religious and historical importance, many still unpublished decades after discovery. They touched the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish world of the Second Temple period, and the background against which Christianity emerged. Yet much of the material seemed to be in the hands of a limited scholarly circle, moving at a pace that felt impossible to justify to those excluded from it. The result was predictable. Suspicion filled the empty space left by delay. When people cannot see the evidence, they begin to imagine what the evidence must contain. And when the subject involves ancient scripture, lost sects, possible treasure, Jerusalem, and the origins of major religious traditions, imagination does not remain modest for long. The public began to hear that the scrolls might contain explosive secrets. Perhaps they revealed a version of Judaism too strange for religious authorities. Perhaps they undermined Christianity. Perhaps they contained hidden truths about Jesus, the early church, or the origins of biblical texts. Perhaps the delay was not scholarly caution, but suppression. Many of these claims outran the evidence, but the conditions that allowed them to grow were not imaginary. That is the uncomfortable balance. The conspiracy theories were often exaggerated, sometimes wildly so. Yet the frustration with limited access was not foolish. It is possible for outsiders to be wrong about what is being hidden and still be right that too much is being controlled. The scrolls became a case study in how secrecy, even when partly accidental or bureaucratic, changes public trust. Scholars may understand delay as procedure. The public often reads delay as concealment. Institutions may speak of preservation. Outsiders may hear possession. Experts may say, the work is difficult, and listeners may wonder, then why are so few allowed to do it? In this sense, the modern history of the scrolls echoed the ancient one in an unexpected way. Again, a library was hidden. Again, only a few knew exactly what lay inside. Again, others had to wait for fragments. This parallel should not be pushed too far, but it is hard to ignore. The ancient caves concealed the scrolls by accident of history. The modern system concealed parts of them through access, hierarchy, and delay. In both cases, the result was the same emotional atmosphere. Something important existed, but remained partially out of reach. And out of reach is where myths breed. We should pause here to give the scholars their due. Many devoted years of careful labor to texts that were brutally difficult to reconstruct. Their editions, transcriptions, photographs, and analyses made serious understanding possible. Without that work, the scrolls might have remained a pile of damaged leather and wishful thinking. Scholarship can be slow because the truth deserves patience, but scholarship can also become possessive. A fragment can turn into territory. A project can become a kingdom. A discovery made by chance can become the guarded property of those who arrived at the right institutional moment. And when that happens, the public story of knowledge becomes entangled with prestige, authority, and resentment. The Dead Sea Scrolls suffered from that entanglement. For decades, the delay shaped not only academic careers, but the popular imagination. The unpublished scrolls became almost more famous because they were unpublished. Their absence from public view made them seem powerful. Their silence was interpreted as threat. In a strange way, the unknown scrolls became a screen onto which people projected whatever secret they most wanted or feared to find. That is why the publication controversy matters historically. It is not just gossip about scholars behaving badly or institutions moving slowly. It reveals how ancient evidence becomes modern power. Who controls access to the past can influence the questions people ask, the theories that gain legitimacy, and the timing of public understanding. The past may be dead, but custody of the past is very much alive. Eventually, wider access and publication changed the situation. More material became available. The field opened. Many of the most dramatic claims lost force as the actual texts could be studied more broadly. The scrolls turned out to be extraordinary, but not in the way sensational rumors had promised. They did not need to contain a single devastating secret to matter. Their true importance was deeper, slower, and harder to turn into a headline. That may be the quiet irony of the whole affair. The delay encouraged people to expect a hidden explosion. What the scrolls actually offered was something more demanding. Evidence that transformed entire fields of study through accumulation, comparison, and context. Not one forbidden sentence, not a locked confession, a vast, damaged archive of ancient Jewish life and thought. Still, the shadow of secrecy never fully disappeared. Once a discovery has been surrounded by restricted access, every later explanation has to work harder to earn trust. Even responsible scholarship can sound evasive to people trained by decades of rumor. And the scrolls, because they sit so close to sacred history, remain especially vulnerable to suspicion. That suspicion would become its own story. Not the story of what the scrolls say, but the story of what people wanted them to say. The difference is crucial, because the next phase of the Dead Sea Scrolls was not only about manuscripts and publication. It was about conspiracy, belief, disappointment, and the modern hunger for a revelation that would finally overturn the official version of history. The scrolls had emerged from caves. Now they would enter the more unstable darkness of public imagination. By the time most people heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were no longer only ancient manuscripts. They had become a mood, a cave in the desert. Religious texts older than expected, scholars with limited access, decades of delay, rumors of treasure, rumors of suppressed truth, rumors that somewhere among the fragments was a revelation too dangerous for churches, governments, or academic authorities to release. It is easy to laugh at some of this now. Too easy, perhaps. Because the most interesting thing about the scroll conspiracies is not that people invented wild theories. People invent wild theories around almost anything ancient, especially if it involves religion and missing evidence. The more important question is why the Dead Sea Scrolls became such fertile ground for suspicion in the first place. The answer is uncomfortable because it is mixed. On one side, many sensational claims were unsupported. The scrolls did not reveal a secret biography of Jesus. They did not prove that Christianity was a simple copy of a Qumran sect. They did not contain a hidden gospel being deliberately buried by frightened authorities. They did not overturn every familiar account of biblical history in one clean blow. But on the other side, the conditions around the scrolls made suspicion feel plausible to many outsiders. For years, access really was restricted. Publication really was slow. A small scholarly circle really did hold enormous control over material of enormous public importance. And the scrolls really did touch sensitive subjects: the history of the Hebrew Bible, the diversity of Judaism before the destruction of the temple, and the world out of which Christianity emerged. That combination is volatile. A secret does not need to exist for secrecy to do damage. Sometimes the locked door matters more than what is behind it. People see the lock, not the archival difficulty. They see the delay, not the thousands of fragments. They see religious institutions nearby, not the painstaking work of paleography, conservation, and reconstruction. And because the scrolls were both ancient and incomplete, almost anyone could imagine the missing pieces saying what they most wanted them to say. This is where conspiracy becomes a form of storytelling. A conspiracy theory offers clarity. It says, the confusion is intentional. The gaps are evidence. The experts are not slow. They are hiding something. The difficulty of the material is not a problem to be studied. It is a smokescreen. The world is not complicated. Someone knows the truth and has locked it away. That story is emotionally powerful. It is also often wrong. The reality of the scrolls was less clean and therefore harder to sell. There was no single master secret. There was a publication bottleneck, academic territoriality, institutional caution, genuine technical difficulty, political complexity, and the ordinary human tendency to guard prestige once one has it. None of that is noble, but it is not the same as a grand plot to suppress a dangerous revelation. In a strange way, the truth is more revealing than the rumor. A grand conspiracy would make the modern guardians of the scrolls almost mythic. The more human story is smaller and sharper. Knowledge can be delayed by bureaucracy, ambition, caution, hierarchy, and professional control without requiring a secret council in a dark room. History does not need a villain with a cloak when a committee, a filing cabinet, and academic rivalry will do. That is not as cinematic. It is more believable. The claims about Christianity deserve special care. The scrolls are profoundly important for understanding the Jewish background of early Christianity. They show that ideas often thought of as distinctively Christian, apocalyptic expectation, language of light and darkness, communal discipline, scriptural interpretation aimed at the present age, existed within the broader Jewish world before and around the time Christianity emerged. That matters greatly. But similarity is not identity. Finding parallels between the scrolls and early Christian writings does not mean one group secretly copied the other in a simplistic way. It means they shared a historical environment. They breathed some of the same religious air. They inherited common scriptures, lived under related pressures, and asked overlapping questions about purity, judgment, authority, and the end of the age. The scrolls did not make early Christianity disappear into Qumran. They made the Jewish world around early Christianity more vivid. That distinction is crucial. Sensational theories often flatten history into a trapdoor. Pull one lever, and an entire religion collapses. Serious history works differently. It complicates origins. It shows relationships. It reveals that movements emerge from crowded landscapes, not empty stages. The scrolls show a Second Temple Jewish world far more diverse than many people once imagined. That discovery can be unsettling, but not because it proves some hidden scandal. It is unsettling because it reminds us that later religious boundaries were not always obvious at the time. Before Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity took their more recognizable later forms, there were many Jewish voices arguing over scripture, law, priesthood, purity, messianic hope, and divine judgment. The scrolls preserve some of those voices. They do not hand us a single forbidden key. This may be why the conspiracy mood was so persistent. The actual importance of the scrolls required patience. It required learning the difference between a textual variant and a theological earthquake, between a parallel phrase and direct dependence, between a sectarian rule and the origin of a church. Popular imagination often does not enjoy those distinctions. It wants the door kicked open, but the scrolls reward a slower eye. They changed history not by detonating one secret, but by altering the ground beneath many fields at once. Biblical scholars gained older witnesses to scriptural texts. Historians of Judaism gained direct evidence of sectarian thought from the Second Temple period. Scholars of early Christianity gained a richer Jewish context for ideas that had sometimes been treated as isolated or entirely new. Archaeologists gained a landscape of manuscripts, caves, ruins, and unresolved connections. None of that is small. It is simply not a conspiracy thriller. There is also a deeper irony. The people who imagined suppressed secrets were, in a distorted way, responding to something true. The scrolls did threaten overly simple stories. Not necessarily official church doctrine in the crude way some claimed, and not Jewish tradition in the way alarmists sometimes implied. They threatened simplification itself. They showed that sacred history was textually layered. They showed that ancient Judaism was internally diverse. They showed that religious identity in the first century was contested, argued, disciplined, visionary, and unstable. They showed that the Bible's transmission was both more reliable in broad continuity and more human in detail than many popular accounts allowed. That is harder to package than the secret they hid from you, but it is far more interesting. The conspiracy that grew around the scrolls was not simple because it fed on real frustrations and false conclusions at the same time. It took genuine delay and turned it into imagined suppression. It took real religious significance and turned it into melodrama. It took scholarly caution and sometimes mistook it for fear. And occasionally, it took academic arrogance and correctly recognized that experts are not immune to power. This is why the story still matters beyond the scrolls themselves. It asks how public trust is built around ancient evidence. It asks what happens when scholars possess materials that belong, in a broader sense, to human history. It asks how institutions should balance preservation, expertise, and access. And it reminds us that when knowledge is withheld too long, the silence becomes an author of its own. The Dead Sea Scrolls were never going to remain only in scholarly journals. They were too old, too biblical, too mysterious, too physically dramatic. Cave discoveries do not stay quiet. Neither do fragments that seem to sit near the roots of living religious traditions. The public wanted meaning. Some scholars offered it too slowly. Others offered it too narrowly. Into that gap came speculation. And speculation, once it finds a cave, rarely leaves empty-handed. The better response is not to replace one exaggeration with another. It is to return to the texts themselves with clear eyes. They are strange enough without invention. They are disruptive enough without fantasy. They do not need to contain a hidden gospel or a buried scandal to matter. Their real power lies in what they actually changed. Not rumor, not treasure, not a forbidden confession sealed away by frightened authorities, but the historical map of Judaism, Scripture, and the world from which Christianity emerged. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not change history by giving the world one explosive sentence. They changed history by making the old picture harder to simplify. That may sound modest, but in scholarship, it is often the deeper kind of revolution. A single shocking claim can be argued over, exaggerated, dismissed, or absorbed into popular myth. But a body of evidence that changes the background of everything, that is more durable. It does not knock down one wall, it alters the room. Before the scrolls, much of what scholars knew about ancient Jewish texts, biblical transmission, and sectarian life in the Second Temple period came through later copies, later traditions, outside descriptions, or reconstruction. There were important sources, of course, but the scrolls brought something different. Manuscripts from the period itself, or close enough to it to narrow the distance dramatically. That mattered for the Hebrew Bible. For the first time, scholars had access to biblical manuscripts far older than the medieval Hebrew copies that had long been central to textual study. The result was not the collapse of the biblical text, as some sensational voices imagined, nor was it a flat confirmation that every detail had remained identical across all manuscripts. The evidence was more interesting than either extreme. The scrolls showed both continuity and variation. Many biblical texts were recognizably close to later transmitted forms. That continuity is significant. It shows careful preservation across long centuries. But there were also differences, spellings, phrases, arrangements, and readings that revealed a living textual tradition before later standardization. The biblical text had not floated untouched above history. It had moved through history, carried by scribes, communities, and habits of transmission. This is one of the scroll's most important lessons. A sacred text can be revered and still have a history. For some people, that feels unsettling. For others, it is clarifying. The scrolls make it harder to treat the Bible either as a book with no human transmission or as a text so unstable that continuity disappears. The evidence resists both exaggerations. It shows a world where Scripture mattered deeply, but where the exact boundaries and textual forms of that Scripture were still developing in ways later readers often forget. The scrolls also changed the study of Second Temple Judaism. That phrase can sound academic, almost sterile, but it names one of the most creative and turbulent periods in Jewish history. The temple still stood in Jerusalem. Priestly authority mattered. Foreign empires shaped daily life. Different Jewish groups debated law, purity, interpretation, calendar, resurrection, angels, messianic hope, and the meaning of Israel's story under pressure. The scrolls brought that diversity into sharper focus. They showed that ancient Judaism was not a single, smooth road leading neatly toward later forms. It was a landscape of paths. Some converged, some disappeared, some left only traces. The community or communities reflected in the scrolls were deeply Jewish, but not identical with the traditions that would later become Rabbinic Judaism. Their writings preserve another possibility. not a replacement for later Judaism, but a witness to the wider range of Jewish life before later boundaries hardened. That is historically valuable because winners tend to organize memory. Traditions that survive openly often become the frame through which earlier history is understood. Groups that vanish are harder to hear. They may be described by outsiders, condemned by opponents, or simply forgotten. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave one such lost or marginal voice a way to speak again, not completely, not comfortably, but directly enough to complicate the record. And then there is Christianity. Here, the scrolls must be handled with special care, because this is where public imagination often runs ahead of the evidence. The scrolls do not secretly narrate the life of Jesus. They do not contain Christian gospels. They do not prove that Christianity was merely copied from Qumran. Those claims flatten both histories. What they do is more useful. They show the Jewish world in which early Christianity became intelligible. Ideas that appear in early Christian texts did not arise in an empty room. Language of light and darkness, expectation of judgment, interpretation of Scripture as speaking to the present age, hope for divine intervention, concern with purity, communal discipline, and apocalyptic imagination. These belonged to a broader Jewish environment. The scrolls let us see that environment more clearly. That does not erase difference. It explains context. Early Christianity developed in conversation with the Jewish world of its time, even where it eventually moved in new directions. The scrolls help us understand that world as dense, varied, and charged with expectation. They make the emergence of Christianity seem less like a sudden object dropped into history, and more like one movement arising within a crowded field of Jewish hopes, arguments, and interpretations. This is why the scrolls matter beyond biblical footnotes. They changed the atmosphere of origin stories. They made it harder to imagine ancient religious history as a sequence of clean handoffs. First this, then that. One tradition ending neatly as another begins. Real history is messier. The scrolls show overlap. They show debate. They show communities preserving older texts while generating new interpretations. They show people living inside inherited scripture while also reshaping its meaning for crisis. They also changed how scholars think about canon. Not every text valued by a community becomes part of a later Bible. Some writings found among the scrolls were clearly meaningful to certain Jewish groups, but did not hold the same later status in Judaism. That gap is important. It reminds us that canons are not merely lists of books. They are historical decisions, community boundaries, and acts of memory. A text can be influential without becoming canonical. A writing can shape imagination and still remain outside the final collection. The scrolls preserve that middle space. They let us see writings in use before later history had finished sorting them. There is something humbling in that. Modern readers often inherit religious traditions after centuries of definition. We receive categories that feel obvious because generations before us made them so. Biblical and non-biblical, orthodox and sectarian, Jewish and Christian, mainstream and marginal. The scrolls take us back to a time when some of those categories were not yet fixed, or not fixed in the same way. They do not dissolve every distinction, but they show how much life existed before the labels settled. Perhaps the greatest change, then, was not a single discovery about one text or one sect. It was a change in scale. The scrolls expanded the known library of ancient Judaism. They gave scholars older witnesses to biblical books. They preserved sectarian rules and interpretations. They revealed apocalyptic hopes in their own language. They showed the seriousness of scribal culture in a desert community or network of communities. They connected material objects to religious imagination, and they forced humility. Every fragment is a reminder that the ancient world did not preserve itself for our convenience. We have enough to learn from, but not enough to control completely. A missing line may hold the word that would settle an argument. A damaged edge may have contained the name we most want. A fragment can illuminate one corner and leave the next in darkness. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed history because they made the past more detailed and less tidy. They did not replace mystery with certainty. They replaced a smaller mystery with a larger, better-informed one. That is the mark of a truly important discovery. It does not merely answer old questions. It teaches us which questions were too small. The Dead Sea Scrolls are famous because they were found. They remain fascinating because they are not fully explained. That is a difficult thing to admit after decades of study. Modern audiences often expect that once enough experts have worked on a discovery, the story should settle into a final version. The cave was found. The texts were published. The ruins were excavated. The fragments were sorted. Surely by now we should know who wrote the scrolls, who hid them, and exactly why. But ancient evidence does not always become clearer simply because time passes. Sometimes more evidence gives us better questions. The first unresolved question is the one most people ask first. Who wrote the scrolls? The traditional answer points toward a sectarian Jewish community near Qumran, often associated with the Essenes. That theory remains influential because it explains a great deal. The strict rules, concern for purity, separation from wider society, communal discipline, and apocalyptic expectation all seem to fit what ancient writers say about Essene-like groups. The nearby ruins provide a physical setting that appears to match parts of the textual world. Yet the answer is not airtight. The scrolls are not all the same kind of writing. Some are biblical manuscripts. Some are sectarian rules. Some are hymns, interpretations, calendars, apocalyptic works, and other compositions. Some may have been copied locally. Others may have circulated more widely. A library can preserve writings produced by its owners, writings inherited from others, writings copied for study, and writings kept because they were useful or revered. So, who wrote the scrolls may be the wrong singular question. A better question might be, who collected them, used them, copied them, and finally hid them? Those could be overlapping groups, but they need not be identical. This matters because a manuscript's final resting place is not always its birthplace. A text found near Qumran may have been copied there, brought there, or hidden there during crisis. Treating every scroll as the direct product of one local group makes the evidence more orderly than it may have been. Then there is the question of Qumran itself. Was it a sectarian settlement? A kind of communal center? A fortress-like site? An estate? A pottery production area? A place whose function changed over time? Scholars have debated the interpretation of the ruins because archaeology does not label itself. A water installation can support an argument about ritual purity, but it may also have practical uses. A room can be interpreted as a writing space, but the evidence must be handled carefully. Pottery links can connect caves and site, But connections do not automatically prove authorship. Qumran is close to the caves. That fact matters. But proximity is not a confession. The ruins and the manuscripts clearly belong in the same investigation, yet the exact nature of their relationship remains debated. For many, the settlement and scrolls are best understood together. For others, Qumran may have been less central to the production of the manuscripts than earlier theories assumed. The truth may lie between those positions, a local community connected to some scrolls, while the full collection reflects a broader Jewish textual world. This mixed possibility is not a compromise for the sake of politeness. It may be how ancient libraries actually worked. Collections are rarely pure. They accumulate. They absorb older material. They preserve texts whose origins are not local. They hold disagreement without always explaining it. The scrolls may represent the literary life of a sectarian group, but that life could include texts copied elsewhere, traditions shared across Judea, and writings valued by multiple communities. Another unresolved question concerns why the scrolls were hidden in different caves. The answer seems obvious at first. Danger. And danger is probably part of the story. The 1st century brought violent instability, and the Roman advance toward Jerusalem and the Dead Sea region gives a plausible context for concealment. Precious writings may have been placed in caves to protect them. But once again, the obvious answer is not complete. Different caves contained different kinds and quantities of material. Some scrolls appear to have been stored with care. Others survived only in scattered fragments. The deposits may not all belong to one event. Some may have been placed earlier, some later, some carefully, some hurriedly. Certain caves may have been used by people closely tied to Qumran. Others may reflect different circumstances. A single emergency hiding scene is vivid. The evidence may be messier. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls force us to become more disciplined than our imagination. The mind wants one night, one group, one decision. People rushing with jars under threat. A final glance toward Jerusalem. A cave sealed in fear. That may capture part of the emotional truth, but it risks turning a complex archaeological record into a painting. The actual story may involve repeated acts of storage, concealment, retrieval, abandonment, and loss. It may involve ordinary library practice as well as emergency protection. It may involve a community that expected to return, or people who knew they might not. And then there is the library itself. Was it a library in the full sense? An archive? A cache? A collection of sacred writings? A Genisa-like deposit of worn texts? A mixture of valued manuscripts and emergency stores? The word library is useful because it communicates the scale and variety of the find. But it can mislead if it makes us imagine shelves, catalogs, and institutional order. The caves did not preserve a library room. They preserved remains. The difference matters. We are reconstructing an intellectual world from damaged objects removed from their original arrangements. Some early handling of the scrolls, before full archaeological control, also complicates interpretation. Context was lost. Fragments moved. Objects passed through markets. Even where excavation was careful, the ancient situation had already been disturbed by time, animals, collapse, and human intervention. This is why certainty must be earned slowly. The unanswered questions are not failures of scholarship. They are the honest shape of the evidence. Still, uncertainty does not mean ignorance. We know far more than the first scholars did when the earliest fragments appeared. We know the scrolls preserve biblical texts, sectarian writings, interpretations, hymns, legal discussions, calendars, and apocalyptic expectations. We know they belong to the world of Second Temple Judaism. We know they reveal a religious landscape more diverse than later simplifications suggest. We know the caves, ruins, and manuscripts form one of the most important archaeological and textual discoveries of the 20th century. But the largest questions remain open at the edges. Who exactly were the people behind the collection? How many communities are represented? What was Qumran's precise role? Why were certain texts placed in certain caves? Did some scrolls come from Jerusalem? How much of the collection was local, and how much was gathered from elsewhere? The frustrating thing is that the missing answers are not decorative. They shape the whole interpretation, change the origin of the library, and the meaning of the scrolls shifts. Make Qumran central, and the manuscripts become the voice of a desert sectarian community. Make Jerusalem more important, and the caves become part of a wider emergency effort to save Jewish texts and wealth from catastrophe. Allow both, and the story becomes richer but harder to summarize. Perhaps that is why the Dead Sea Scrolls still hold attention. They are not a puzzle with one missing piece. They are a broken mosaic, and some of the missing pieces are precisely where the faces would be. That does not make the mosaic worthless. It makes the surviving pieces matter more. The dust around Qumran has not yielded a simple answer, but it has yielded something better than certainty without evidence. It has given us a disciplined mystery, one bounded by manuscripts, ruins, language, material analysis, and historical context. The questions remain not because no one has looked, but because the past has only given us part of itself. And now, under new kinds of light, even that partial past is changing. Letters too faint for earlier eyes are being recovered. Damaged fragments are being compared. Materials are being tested. Images reveal what ordinary sight could not. The scrolls, long after their discovery, are still becoming more readable. The desert gave them back once. Modern science keeps asking what else they have not yet said. The Dead Sea Scrolls have already had more than one discovery. The first was physical. The caves, the jars, the leather and parchment and copper emerging from the desert after centuries of concealment. The second was scholarly. The slow recognition of what the texts contained, how old they were, and what they could reveal about Scripture, Judaism, and the world before the destruction of Jerusalem. But there is a third discovery still taking place. It happens under light. Not dramatic light, not torchlight in a cave, not the golden glow of a museum display case. This is colder, more technical, and in its own way more intimate. Multispectral imaging, infrared photography, digital enhancement, conservation science, material analysis, and patient comparison of fragments so small they can seem almost insulting to human ambition. A fragment the size of a fingernail may carry part of a letter. Part of a letter may affect a word. A word may affect a line. And a line, if it belongs to the right text, can reopen an argument that scholars thought had gone quiet. This is the strange afterlife of the scrolls. They are ancient objects, but they keep becoming new evidence. Not because someone is inventing more mystery, but because tools improve. The manuscript that looked blank to one generation may not be blank to the next. Ink that vanished from ordinary sight can sometimes be coaxed back through wavelengths beyond the range of the human eye. Darkened surfaces can be photographed in ways that separate writing from damage. Fragments once treated as isolated scraps can be compared digitally with others across collections. The scrolls are not changing. Our ability to see them is. That distinction matters. Modern technology does not magically solve the Dead Sea Scrolls. It does not turn every torn edge into a complete manuscript or reveal a hidden master key beneath the damage. Much remains lost. Some letters are gone. Some surfaces are too ruined. Some fragments are too small, too ambiguous, or too displaced from context to carry confident meaning. But the gains are real. A faint stroke becomes visible. A damaged column becomes more legible. A suspected match between fragments becomes stronger or weaker. The skin on which a text was written can be examined for clues about preparation, origin, or relationship to other pieces. Ink can be studied. Fibers, collagen, mineral traces, and patterns of damage can become part of the evidence. This changes the work from reading alone to listening with instruments. The old scholar's eye is still essential, but it is no longer alone at the table. There is something almost poetic in that, though the laboratory would probably object to the word. The scrolls survived because the desert stripped life down to dryness and salt. Now they are studied with machines that detect what ordinary vision cannot. Two very different forms of severity meet across time. The severity of the landscape that preserved them, and the severity of science that asks them for details. Conservation is equally important, and less glamorous. A manuscript can be damaged by the very desire to study it. Handling, light, humidity, temperature, and display all carry risk. The scrolls are not symbols first. They are materials, animal skin, ink, metal, fibers, surfaces that have already endured more than anyone had any right to expect. To preserve them now requires restraint, the discipline not to touch too much, not to expose too long, not to satisfy curiosity at the expense of survival. That restraint is a kind of respect. It recognizes that the scrolls do not belong only to the present generation of scholars, viewers, or institutions. They also belong to future readers with better tools than ours. There may be letters that cannot yet be recovered, but might be recoverable later. There may be fragment relationships that current methods miss. A responsible conservator must sometimes leave a question unanswered so that a later hand can ask it more safely. This is not the romantic version of discovery, but it may be the more mature one. The early story of the scrolls was full of urgency. Find them, buy them, claim them, publish them, argue over them. The modern scientific phase asks for another virtue, patience without possession. It treats the fragments not as trophies or secrets, but as vulnerable witnesses, and witnesses can be misunderstood. Scientific analysis has also helped expose a more recent problem. Not every supposed Dead Sea Scroll fragment that appears in modern collections can be trusted. The fame of the scrolls created a market, and markets attract imitation, exaggeration, and sometimes forgery. This complicates the story in a very human way. The ancient fragments survived by accident and danger. Modern fragments, especially those without secure archaeological context, must survive suspicion. That does not diminish the authentic scrolls. It reminds us why context matters. A fragment found in a controlled excavation, tied to a cave and a broader manuscript environment, carries a different kind of authority from a piece that appears later through the antiquities trade with a convenient story attached. Writing may look ancient. Material may be old. But an old surface can be used deceptively, and a convincing fragment can still be false. The more valuable the past becomes, the more carefully it must be questioned. Here, the scrolls teach a lesson beyond themselves. Discovery is not a single moment of wonder. It is a long struggle against error. Error from damage, error from wishful thinking, error from poor access, error from overconfident theories, error from the market, error from the perfectly human desire to make a fragment say more than it can. Modern imaging and analysis do not remove interpretation. They discipline it. They make some readings less likely, some more likely, and some newly possible. They give scholars better evidence, but still require judgment. A clearer letter does not always create a clearer history. Sometimes it only makes the uncertainty sharper. And yet, there is a quiet thrill in this stage of the story. No shepherd throws a stone. No jar breaks in the dark. No first scholar realizes, with a quickened pulse, that a manuscript may be older than expected. Instead, a technician adjusts an image. A scholar compares a stroke. A conservation report notes a feature. A database links pieces that have been separated by time, handling, and human confusion. The drama is smaller. The consequences can still be large, because the scrolls are not only famous artifacts, they are cumulative evidence. Every improvement matters because the larger picture is built from small recoveries. The identity of a text, the order of fragments, the presence of a variant reading, the material relationship between pieces. Each detail can change how we reconstruct the library and the world behind it. This is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are not finished. They may never be finished in the way the public imagines. There may be no final announcement, no last locked secret, no single evening when scholars say, "Now we know everything." Instead, the scrolls will likely continue to yield themselves unevenly. A better reading here, a corrected match there, a rejected fragment, a newly visible letter. A more careful understanding of how one manuscript relates to another. The past does not always return as revelation. Sometimes it returns as revision. That may be the most honest form of return. Each new technique does not erase earlier scholarship, but tests it. Some old readings stand, some fall, some become more nuanced. The scrolls keep asking the same thing of every generation. Look again, but do not pretend that looking is the same as knowing. Under new light, the fragments become less silent. But they do not become obedient. They remain damaged, partial, stubbornly ancient. They give us enough to deepen the story, not enough to end it. And perhaps that is fitting. A library hidden in caves for nearly 2,000 years should not surrender all at once simply because modern eyes have arrived with better cameras. The desert gave back the scrolls. Science is giving back letters. The full voices behind them still stand at a distance, half recovered, half withheld, speaking through skin, ink, copper, and absence. In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us the simple pleasure of a solved mystery. They give us something better and more difficult. They give us voices, not full voices, not voices preserved cleanly from beginning to end. Voices torn, darkened, argued over, sometimes no larger than a few surviving letters on a fragment. But voices nonetheless, from a fearful, divided, intensely serious age when Scripture was not a quiet inheritance, but a living force pressed against crisis. The people behind the scrolls did not know they were writing for us. That may be the most important thing to remember. They were not composing museum pieces. They were copying sacred texts, building rules, preserving interpretations, condemning enemies, singing hymns, calculating purity, imagining judgment, and preparing for a future that they believed was close. Their world was immediate to them. Rome was not a textbook. Jerusalem was not archaeology. The temple was not a memory yet. The arguments were alive. Then history moved. The temple fell. Communities scattered, transformed, or vanished. Later traditions took shape. Names were forgotten. Caves sealed themselves in heat and darkness. The scrolls became absent from human memory, not because they had stopped mattering, but because the people who could explain them were gone. When they returned, they did not return politely. They disturbed categories. They showed Scripture before final standardization. They revealed Jewish diversity before later boundaries hardened. They gave early Christianity a richer Jewish background without turning it into a simple copy of Qumran. They exposed the seriousness of a community, or network of communities, that read the world as a battlefield of truth and falsehood. They also taught caution. The scrolls changed much, but they did not answer everything. We still do not know exactly who wrote every text, how the full collection came together, or why certain manuscripts ended up in certain caves. Qumran remains central, but not simple. The Essene theory remains powerful, but not a padlock on the evidence. The copper scroll still points toward treasure without handing us the ground beneath it. That refusal is part of their force. A lesser discovery might have given us one clean revelation and then gone quiet. The Dead Sea Scrolls keep resisting closure. Under new light, they reveal letters. Under new questions, they reveal assumptions. Under careful study, they remind us how much of the ancient world survives only by accident. And perhaps that is the final lesson. History is not only what people meant to preserve, it is also what escaped destruction by chance, geography, neglect, fear, and weather. A jar in a cave can outlast an empire. A fragment can challenge a library of assumptions. A forgotten community can re-enter the conversation centuries after its buildings have collapsed. The scrolls came back from the desert, but not as an answer key. They came back as evidence of human urgency. People once believed these words mattered enough to copy, carry, hide, and protect. They believed their age was broken, their enemies dangerous, their discipline necessary, and their hope worth preserving. We do not have to share their worldview to recognize the weight of that act. Above the salt sea, the caves are still there. The landscape remains severe. The cliffs still hold their pale silence. But now, when we look toward them, we do not see emptiness in quite the same way. We see a place where the ancient world almost disappeared, and then, impossibly, spoke again. Not loudly, not completely, but enough to remind us that the past is never as settled as it looks. And some words, hidden in darkness, can wait a very long time before they are read.